welcome to M Pavilion. My name is Jen Zlinsker and I'm the Associate Producer of M Pavilion. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people who are the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Today's Lunchtime M Talk is on the award-winning novel India Dark. We are joined by author Kirsty Murray and Justine Hyde, who is Director of Library Services and Experience at State Library Victoria.
Thanks, Jen. Well, we've got a huge crowd here today. Hopefully we might better pull some people in from the grass to join us. So, Kirsty, I'll firstly introduce you and then move on to our questions. So, Kirsty, you're a prolific author of books for children and young adults. You've written 11 novels and they've won and been shortlisted for many awards, including the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award, WA Premier's Award and the New South Wales Premier's History Award. Kirsty's a 2017 nominee for the prestigious Swedish prize, the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award for lifetime contribution to young people's literature. Let's hope you win that. That's pretty exciting.
It's over 700,000. I'd really like to win it.
Yeah, I bet.
I don't like my chances.
Well, I don't know. Let us know.
Yeah.
Kirsty's also been a guest presenter at literary festivals across Asia, an AsiaLink literature resident at the University of Madras, a member of the Bookwallah Roving Writers Festival and a writer-in-residence at the University of Himachal Pradesh in North India. Kirsty researched her novel India Dark as a creative fellow at the State Library Victoria. Her novels include The Year It All Ended, The 4 Seasons of Lucy Mackenzie, India Dark, which we're talking about today, Vulture's Gate, Market Blues, and the epic quartet of historical fiction Children of the Wind. She also co-edited the groundbreaking Indian-Australian anthology Eat the Sky, Drink the Ocean. Please join me in welcoming Kirsty.
Thank you, friends.
We're going to have time for questions at the end. So
yes, I get thinking
you'll have to
now.
fight. You have to fight for the microphone for that. So we're sitting here in M Pavilion today, Kirsty, and it's designed by Studio Mumbai's Bijoy Jain. It's a beautiful space, especially on a beautiful day like today. So India seems like a good place to start our conversation. So I'm guessing you've been well and truly seduced by India. Can you tell us what it is about the subcontinent that has captured your imagination?
Well, it's a funny thing about being seduced by India because before I wrote this book, India Dark, which was the Creative Fellows project, I'd actually never been to India and I'd actually not been interested in going to India.
Oh, really?
It wasn't, in families I come from quite a big family and the family carved up the world. And I didn't get India.
Which bits did you get?
I actually got America. I just grabbed it.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Which, for my sins, one of my children now live there. And it was my 2 older sisters who got India.
Oh, okay.
Ironically, now we're all grown up, they've never been to India and I've been about 9 times. So, but for a long time, I always associated India with my older sister who was obsessed with Mowgli. So she was Mowgli and you could only be a wolf. You couldn't be anything else. And another sister whose best friend was from Tamil Nadu. And so I steered clear of anything to do with it. I know that sounds like a funny psychology, but I think also growing up in Australia in the mid-20th century, we'd lost touch with India. The White Australia policy had changed our attitude towards it. And so it's funny when people often say to me about how often I've been to India, about that idea of being seduced. And I think what I found most amazing about India is that it's so like us.
In what way?
And it was surprisingly familiar. Well, because our shared colonial history, which I'd never really understood. I'd never really understood post-colonialism. And now I have such a deep understanding of how it's shaped us and how it's shaped India. And I'll tell a little story actually, I think, which illustrates the best understanding of it is when the very first time I went to India was in February 2007 and arrived in Calcutta in the middle of the night. It was completely dark. It was raining. It was hot. It was steamy. It was not what I'd sort of expected to see. People give you these ideas about India and you think, it's all going to be colour and light, but it was dark and it was steamy. And
you're by yourself?
No, I was with my husband, which is just as well, or I would have been freaked out. And the first thing in the morning, after about 5 hours sleep, we got up and went to Modern Girls High. And Modern Girls High is a very long established secondary school, primary and secondary, goes all the way through for girls in downtown Calcutta. And so without actually having seen any daylight, I just got up, walked out into the taxi, went to the school, came in through the foyer. There was a big statue of Ganesha and another of Shiva, and I had 200 12-year-old girls in a room with me. And they were fantastic. They were so fun. That was my introduction to India. The first people I met were 200 12-year-old girls, and they were really interesting because the picture we're given of India is not necessarily the India that exists, because we make our understanding of the world through story. And these kids, their understanding of the world through story was through a really familiar lens, because I asked them what they read, and they'd all read Enid Blyton, and they'd all read Meg Cabot, and they'd all read John Green, and they'd read all the American authors that kids here were reading, and it was like being in a room with 200 girls from Melbourne, though none of them had been to Australia. And we started talking about books and stories and where they came from, and they were full of ideas, but all their ideas were like their imagination had been colonised by British and American forces.
Yeah, right.
And that's a really familiar thing when you talk with kids here too. You often find, you say, okay, guys, let's write a story, because I do a lot of workshops in schools, and the kids will all write down and set their stories in Brooklyn. And I go, have you been to Brooklyn? No, but this story's set in Brooklyn, and this story's set in LA, and oh yeah, no, this is set in Edinburgh. Have you been to Edinburgh? No. And because of Harry Potter. And that's a really common thing to encounter in Australian children, that their imaginations have been colonised.
And interesting to then see the same thing in
India. And the same thing in
okay.
India. And when I said to the principal, I said, you know, do these kids read a lot of Indian literature? And they said, yes, they do in their own languages, but not in English.
Right.
So when they think about stories in English, they think about Enid Blyton, they think about Harry Potter, they think about princesses from American universities. And she said that when they have writing competitions, that all the kids enter stories that are set in landscapes like Cherry Tree Farm, which is an Enid Blyton landscape where they have babbling brooks and icicles.
Not
and
very Indian.
Gambling lamps. And she said, this is Calcutta. These children have never seen an icicle in their life.
That's what's so amazing for them, I guess, or that's what's so magical about it, because it's foreign and unfamiliar and exotic.
Yeah, I mean, but I actually just think it's colonialism.
Do you think so?
I actually don't think it's the exotica.
Yeah, okay.
I think because kids in America don't write about Australia.
True.
Nor do they write
Fair
about
point.
India. And kids in England don't write about India. They write about England.
Yeah.
And what you get is like story shapes our understanding. And I hadn't actually read a lot of Indian literature before I went to India. I'd read Tagore and I'd read Kipling. But when I went there, I all of a sudden realised there were all these stories I didn't know. And there was all this... I mean, it was fantastic because we discovered Indian literature, which you don't get in Australia. Mm-hmm. I mean, you get diaspora literature, but we actually are only just starting to see Indian literature that's not from the diaspora very slowly. And some of the most important books in Indian history, really, we don't get here.
Yeah,
and
right.
Amazing books. So the shock of India was not the seduction of the exotic. It was the recognition of like, oh, you feel like that about story too. Oh, that's really strange. And wow, you have all these amazing books I've never read, and you've never read anything from my country either. And why don't we know each other when they're the biggest immigrant group in Australia? And yeah. So it was like, it was startling, but it was not. It was a slow seduction and like a revelation.
Okay.
Like blind dates.
A good one though. A good blind date.
Good blind date.
So you hadn't thought much about India or travelled to India prior to doing the research for India Dark. So is that what set you then on the path of discovery of India? Was that the sort of the initial prompt?
Yeah, I spent 4 months there from that first arrival in Calcutta, and went to the Calcutta Book Fair, which is the biggest book fair in the world, and then went to Chennai, which was where the children from the story had gone in 1910.
Okay.
So we traced our way around India, sort of visiting every location that the children went to, including all the places in Southeast Asia they visited as well.
Okay,
so,
amazing.
And it wasn't, I mean, since then I've been back repeatedly and done more work in India, and the book's been published in India, so it sort of was not something I could have foreseen that the fruit of it was going to go on and on and on. So...
Well, let's talk a little bit about the true story that the novel's based on. So it's based on the story of a troupe of Australian performers who travelled to Melbourne from Melbourne to India. They were called Pollards Lilliputian Opera Company. So can you tell us, Kirsty, how did they end up in India and what happened there and what was the scandal?
The scandal. Well, it doesn't look like anybody here's related to the Pollards, so I can tell the truth. Yeah, they were kind of amazing. The Pollards were really important in Australian theatre history, and they've been forgotten partly because of the scandal. In the 1880s, there was a family in Tasmania that had 18 children, the original Pollard family. And what do you do when you have 18 children? You start a theatre troupe.
Take them on the road.
Yeah, and so from the 1880s onwards, they were a really well-known troupe that performed all around Melbourne. They performed all around Australia. And then as the kids grew up, they formed their own Pollards. So at one stage, there was like 5 Pollard troupes.
Like a dynasty.
Yes, which was really confusing because there were so many of them. And then it was a bit like Young Talent Time, basically. Except for everybody changed their name to Young, like Johnny
right.
Young. So they all changed their name to Pollard. But they weren't Pollards. To research it was mind-boggling. That's why I had to go for
Very confusing, yeah.
Very confusing and very fascinating. And in 1909, Baby Pollard, who was 35 at the time, he was a really interesting character. His name was Arthur Pollard, and he was the youngest of the Pollards to form a troupe. And he took 29 children from Melbourne, mostly working-class kids. Some of them came from Sydney, but about 20 of them were from Melbourne, mostly from single-parent families. And he put together a troupe in 1909, and in July they sailed out from Melbourne and they went right through Southeast Asia, singing and dancing for colonial audiences. So the story actually has a lot of resonance now too about the way we think about young people. And I think also that what I found really interesting about it is that kids in that era understood India and Southeast Asia and South Asia much better than we do because it was part of the empire. And these were children of empire, and they had a really good grasp of what the empire meant. And, of course, there were audiences all across the empire in military cantonments that wanted to be entertained, and the cheapest way to take theatre to them was to take children. Children were cheap. They were cheap to travel with. You didn't have to pay them a lot.
Didn't eat much.
No, they didn't eat much. And you could lock them in their rooms and they had no union. So they were really... There were a lot of child performing troupes that toured the Empire circuit.
And so with the Pollards, this was their first trip? Or they'd done
these
trips
kids
to
had
India?
actually... Some of the children had toured America.
Okay.
They'd been to Manila. They'd been to China, Rangoon... The Empire Circuit, and that's a really interesting facet of this story too, is that nobody has actually written a history of the Empire Circuit, and yet it was a huge scene, and it was only in the State Library that I started to see how big it was. And when I took the project on, I thought, this is so interesting. There'll be lots of history books about this. There were none.
You need to write one.
Oh, no, I did. I wrote a novel about it. But that there are no actually histories of this circuit. So the circuit went all the way to South Africa, and it went to China, and there were magicians and child performers who toured those circuits regularly, and big bands too.
And in what period? What sort of range are we talking about?
Actually from the 1840s.
Through to the early 1900s.
Well, this tour in 1910 sort of busted it wide open.
That's the scandal, right?
Yeah, the scandal. So Arthur Pollard took 29 children from Melbourne. He sailed them up. They performed in Surabaya, Batavia, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Penang, and then they sailed across the Bay of Bengal to Calcutta. But when he got to Calcutta, he only had 26 children.
What happened to the other 3?
Yeah, well, that took me 5 years to find out, and that's in the book. But so it took, he got them to Calcutta, and it was during the time of the Alipore bombing, which was a really famous nationalist part of the Swadeshi movement. So there were a lot of political things happening that were affecting the troupe, and they weren't getting audiences. And then he took them all around India by steam train, going to right across to Allahabad and then Delhi and all the way down to Mumbai, and then to Madras. And in February 1910, on a really hot summer night, the children got off stage at about after midnight, and they walked up to Arthur and they said, "We hate you. You're a lousy manager, and we're not going one step further with you, and we quit." And they all walked out on him. And that's the bare bones of what happened, is that 24 of the 26 children who he had in Madras left him. The other adults who worked with the troop left him and left the children. And the kids went off and set themselves up in hotels across Madras and started performing on rooftops to earn their fares home.
It's an amazing story, isn't it?
It is an amazing story, because once it broke in the British press and then the Australian press and in the Empire press, it wound up being cited in Hansard. It was discussed in Parliament. People were freaked out that the littlest girls were 7 and the oldest girls were 17, and that these kids were wandering in South India without any relatives, without any adult supervision that was familiar to them, that their manager, Arthur, had got custody of them for 2 years. Their parents had signed over custody to this guy, who was 35. So yeah, it was a big scandal.
So how did you originally stumble upon the story? Like what brought you to the story in the first place?
About 10 years earlier, I was working on another book about Australian theatre, it was a novel set on the goldfields, and I went up to Ballarat to research theatre on the goldfields and interviewed a historian called Peter Freund. And Peter Freund's the archivist at Her Majesty's in Ballarat. And he had given a paper about these kids. He said, "Oh, look, there's this story. Some children's writer should write this story, because I'm not a novelist, but there's this story." And he briefly told me, and he said, "Here's my paper. Have a read and see if you can turn it into a novel." And he'd written a really interesting overview of what happened, basically the bare bones of what I just told you. And originally I thought, oh, well, this is great. This is like, really brave kids standing up against a corrupt adult. And this is perfect material for a young adult novel. But when I started actually unpicking it and doing the research, I realized it was a lot more complex than that, and that these girls were formidable and they were scary. And their story was really not what it looked like superficially.
So he gifted you the story?
He gifted me the story, and then that wound up, thanks, Peter, that was 5 years later, having gone around India, spending 4 months touring India, having spent a couple of years going back and forward to Southeast Asia. I wound up going to the British Library, where the biggest collection of papers on colonial India is stored. My wonderful residency at the State Library. Yeah, thanks, Peter. And then it became this book, India Dark.
This wonderful book. So I'm interested to know why you chose to write it as a YA novel.
Well, originally the material came to me through the lens of the children, because there's a theory about young adult authors is that we're all suffering from arrested development and that we're permanently trapped in this immature sort of mind frame. And it's sort of true in a way that, to me, what the appeal in the story was looking at the story from the children's perspective. But because there were 29 of them, it meant that there were so many different lenses to view it. And because it was actually based so closely on fact, I found the true story was so amazing and so convoluted too that I went up feeling sort of held hostage to it. And I did research the lives of a lot of the children beyond the actual tour. It was a very slow book to write, really, from that point of view. But to me, with all my work, what I'm really interested in is the child in time, is the way children in different eras, and even now, I mean, it's still relevant because of those rites of passage and all the confrontations that a teenager has to face, and the changes and understanding your own sexuality. That was a really big part of the story. So it really was a story which I think is actually really important particularly to young female readers. Mm-hmm. And I get very interesting feedback from 15, 16-year-old girls who read it because they can read the subtext. Uh-huh. They understand that these girls are really dealing with things that every girl deals with, apart from all the colour and the movement that goes with spending 8 months on steam trains and in steamships and, confronting all sorts of crises, including the cholera outbreak on the ship and a drunken manager who is actually having an affair with one of the girls, which was the key point of the scandal, and why all the girls turned on him and the boys. They led a riot against him because they were outraged that he'd broken the rules. He'd broken the contract of faith that, that you don't cross that line. And in a way, that's sort of, you read about constantly children who work in performing arts are still facing those sort of things, that the sexualisation of children, children in the working world, children being prematurely brought into the adult world. It's very, it never goes away as a topic, but it is a teen topic. And I suffer from arrested development.
I'm sure you don't. And so you were talking before about our lack of understanding or connection to India and Southeast Asia was part of the motivation for writing it as a YA novel, wanting to open up that world to a young readership?
Well, that became part of the motivation. When I started it, I just thought it was a ripping yarn.
Yeah, well, it is.
And an amazing story. And I couldn't believe that nobody had told me this story before. And I mean, there are over 300 books about Ned Kelly. Sorry, any Ned Kelly fans, we don't need more books about Ned Kelly. But there are so few books about female experience in Australian history. And to me, this was an epic story of a moment in time and the experience of all these different characters too. So understanding India actually came later. I thought I was just writing an epic story about feisty teenagers, and then I discovered after 4 months in India that I was writing about colonialism, that I was writing about different ways of seeing the world. I was writing about truth and lies, that it was a really interesting book to have to try and wrangle onto the page, which is possibly why nobody had written it before and why all the children lied about what happened to them and didn't tell their children. After it came out, I got emails from descendants and relatives saying, "You're kidding. Is that what Great Aunt Ivy was doing?" She never told us. She never told us. And occasionally at events too, a Pollard will pop up and say, "I'm a Pollard." And I go, "Oh, hi."
Do we have any Pollards here today? No, I don't think so. You touched on the concept of truth and lies, and we were talking just a bit before we came up on stage about this terminology that's being thrown around at the moment, the post-truth world and in the Trump era. And your proposition, Kirsty, was that we've been living in a post-truth world for a long time. I'd be interested to hear what your views are on that. So you were talking about how it was a post-truth world in the 1900s as well?
Yeah, well, I think this is why we need journalism too. I mean, I think the biggest worry about contemporary post-truth is the decline of investigative journalism. And reading about the Pollards, though, there was so much misreporting. The children were frightened and they often lied too to get their own way. Anybody who's a parent knows that children are good at lying. It's one of their many talents. And these kids were really good at lying. So they lied to the press, their manager lied, their employees lied. There was a lot of dishonesty happening. And so everything was reported over and over again. And it was a sensational story. Anything you can sensationalise when it's got that element of sex and danger and abused children, that the hardest thing about finding what the true story was wading through hundreds of newspaper reports, each which conflicted had a conflicting version of the events, and the children had conflicting versions of the events, and getting to the bottom of what happened was really, really complex. But I think too, one thing that happened which I didn't follow up with before, with the 1910 tour, when the scandal broke and it got cited in Hansard, they changed the laws about how children could tour. And when that story broke to popular readers, all those juvenile performing troupes died, because all of a sudden people who'd been loving seeing 6-year-olds singing Fifi from Gay Paris, shuffling around on a stage, flinging her skirts up and thinking it was hilarious to watch 6-year-olds doing it, all of a sudden they saw it through a different lens, that this is what good reportage does, is it changes our perception. But if we get swamped too, it killed the junior companies, and inside about 3 years the Pollards were ruined. They were ruined fairly quickly, but J.C. Williamson's troop, Lydiard's troop, there were quite a few troops that just died because all of a sudden the audience were viewing their performances through a different lens, having read all the reportage, having read the true story of what happens to children when their custody is taken from their parents and they are turned into full-time performers. Nobody wanted to watch them anymore. Everybody felt uncomfortable. Their audiences disappeared. And, you know, we see that shifting all the time to the way we receive news. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a post-truth era, it's good to remind yourself that as a reader and as a consumer of news and journalism too, you're actually constantly having to question your sources and look at how reliable they are, and even question why people tell the stories they do.
What the motivation is.
Yeah, well, Mark Twain had this great quote, which is 19th century, where he said, "Truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction has to make sense." And that was the big challenge with telling this book. But
I'm interested in that. You were talking just a minute ago about sort of having to reconcile different versions of the truth, and you know, conflicting newspaper reports and conflicting stories from the performers. As a writer, in trying to reconcile that, how do you? I mean, what choices do you have to make? How do you do that if you're wanting to get a story down on paper and you've got these conflicting views?
You cry a lot.
Okay.
Wine
and crying.
Well, no, and actually thinking about perspective too. So what I tried to do is I tried to look at through everybody's point of view. At one stage, I wrote it from 6 points of view. I actually wrote it from the manager's point of view, who sadly I wound up with a lot of empathy for him, which I know sounds weird, but the more I dug into the story, the more I realised that his story was really complex. He was the 15th of 18 children. He was on the stage by the time he was 6. He found his brother's body on the stairs in Rangoon, who accidentally shot himself when the tour was going badly, because he'd toured the Empire as a child as well. He was married at 19 and separated shortly thereafter, and he was not a proper grown-up, really. His life had been very similar to the children he was trying to manage. And then he fell in love with one of them. And I thought, oh, well, that's, you know, he's behaved unacceptably. But very late in the piece, I discovered that actually he stayed with that girl for the rest of his life.
Oh, really? Okay.
They didn't marry for another 20 years,
right.
or 1926, 16 years after the tour. And I found myself, as I read his life, thinking, I don't want to feel sorry for you. But I did. And I sort of thought that created a whole other understanding of the story, that it's really difficult to write good villains if you feel empathy for them. But I wrote it from the point of view originally of 6 of the characters, then I cut it down to 4, then I got it down to 3, and then finally I decided there were too many voices. But I needed to have 2 voices to show the different perspectives. So I settled on a 13-year-old girl called Posy Swift and a 15-year-old girl called Tilly Sweettrick, who are fictitious characters, but they're based on the girls who are in the troupe. And I gave them the two different perspectives on the same events, so that the reader can make the choice about what was really happening.
And I think are you going to do a reading for us?
Well, there's a little bit at the end here which I think was good about. Well, good. I wrote it.
It's excellent, not good. Excellent.
Well, I think it sort of illustrates how tricky it was, because this is from the point of view of Posy Swift, who's 13. And it's at the end of the book, so lots of plot spoilers.
Block your ears if you don't want to know.
So she's in Port Melbourne, and she's just returned from this epic tour that has changed her worldview. She'd been a fairly modest 13-year-old from Richmond, whose mother was a single mother, and this is her returning and avoiding the press as they get off the boat. Nothing anyone said would ever be the whole truth. Between the facts of the trial, there were so many things that could have been said, so many other trials, so many other truths. There was a baby buried in Allahabad and 2 little girls dancing naked on a balcony in Bombay. Lionel with his broken puppet in Surabaya. Ruby mesmerised in Calcutta, and Tilly sleeping beneath a soldier's greatcoat in Meerut. Eliza weeping in her kimono on the beach at Pondicherry, and Charlie and me kissing in the darkness beneath a banyan tree in Adya. There was more than any one of us could ever tell. And I sort of feel like pulling all those different strands, pulling all those different stories. I read their letters, I looked at their scrapbooks, I read lots of newspaper reports, and the ones that I could really be sure were accurate I used, and then I reframed them for the novel. So, but she sounds too nice, Posy, so I'm just going to read you a little bit to see what Arthur had to deal with.
Another perspective.
Okay, this is another perspective, and this was lifted from the state. When I was in the State Library and I found this, I thought this bit's gold. I found many versions of it in the newspaper rooms from the newspapers of 1910. And this scene's just outside Singapore. They've left Melbourne. They've already performed in Indonesia. And they've been put in quarantine because cholera has broken out on the boat. Cholera was often a big problem in this area when people were travelling. So this is told from the point of view of Tilly, who's the other voice in the book. At the end of our first week in quarantine, I was quietly making my way to the dining hall for rehearsals when it happened. As I turned onto the main deck, a dozen girls came pelting towards me. Ruby was in the lead, her tawny hair loose. She threw her arms up in the air to slow her pace and nearly collided with me. While the others streamed past, she put her arms on my shoulders, breathless with laughter. "Come on," she said. "We're playing Stampede." She grabbed my hand and broke into a run again, dragging me through the crowd of girls. "Charge!" she yelled. And the whole retinue of big ones, middlings, and even little Flora and Daisy went racing to the stern, their shoes slapping loudly on the wooden deck. The steamer seemed to rock under the force of us, and I found a bubble of laughter moving up through my chest. It was the silliest race in the world. 20 girls running on the deck of a steamship. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a crowd of sailors standing above us. Even the black-faced stokers had come up from the furnace to watch the horde of girls in their flying skirts. And I saw Miss Thrupp and Eloise standing by an open door, shouting and waving for us to stop. But no one listened. The only voice that rang clear over the sound of the sea and the steamer was Ruby's. "Stampede! Stampede!" she cried, and the girls squealed and shrieked and slid recklessly towards the other end of the ship. We had turned for the next race when Mr. Arthur came striding down the deck towards us. Ruby held my hand tighter. "Let's charge him," she said, her eyes bright and fierce. That's when I tried to twist free. Some of the middling girls stopped running and began to murmur, disappearing around the stern of the steamer. Suddenly, there was only a handful of us. Ruby hesitated. Mr. Arthur grabbed her by both arms. "Stop that! You're hurting me!" she cried out. "You stupid girl. What do you think you're up to? You're leading a riot." "We're only having fun, playing," she said. "You said go and amuse yourself, Ruby. You know perfectly well what I meant. Stop being childish. If you treat me like a child, why shouldn't I act like one? You will go to your cabin and stay there for the rest of the day. You can't keep us cooped up in those poky cabins any longer. What do you think we are? Pigs? You think you can keep us in our little piggy pens and then trot us out when you fancy?" Then she started to oink, snort, and squeal, as if she really was a pig. Mr. Arthur grew bright red in the face. Then he did it. Anyway, and what he did was a huge point of contention.
You have to read the book to find out.
Between the girls and Arthur Pollard.
So that was from a newspaper report?
Yeah, that was from, it was repeated in newspapers around the world. It was in newspapers in Ceylon. Actually, the first one I read was in the Ceylon Times.
Okay.
And then it travelled through the empire and it wound up in the Argus and the Age here in Australia too.
So it would be remiss of me, Kirsty, if I didn't ask you about your time at the State Library and your fellowship. And that's a nice segue, talking about being in the newspaper's reading room. Can you tell us a little bit about the creative fellowship that you did at the State Library and how you used the collections to inform your research?
Oh, I love the State Library.
So do I.
The hardest bit about the fellowship was ending it and having to give back my pass.
Kick you out.
Yeah, you kicked me out. Could have lived there forever. Well, it's such a fantastic resource, actually. Everybody knows that. But when you're writing fiction, it's not the same as writing history. You're looking through a different lens, and you're looking to smell and taste and touch and feel and experience those characters. Hi. Cute. Experience those characters in a different way. So the State Library is just like a treasure trove for fiction writers because there are so many different angles to look at it through. So I chose to do my fellowship part-time over 6 months. It was meant to be 3 months full-time. I think I was there actually for about 8 months.
Most fellows usually
before you
do
asked
stay
for
a
my
little bit
key
longer.
back. And I used all sorts of different collections. The newspaper room was really great for tracking the children. And I also used the Alma collection, which is the magic collection, because a lot of the people who toured the Empire in the Edwardian period were magicians. That was a really big connection between Australia and India, was the magic. And I read a lot of memoirs of magicians and researched a lot of the details of their tours so that I could use that material to flesh out the things I couldn't know about the tour. So every theatre that the children performed in, I often found a version of an event there written by a magician from the Magic Collection. And I wound up making one of the boys in the troupe a magician as well, because each of the children had a different strength. And then a really spooky thing happened because when I'm putting a novel together, what I do for each character is I imagine their entire life. I imagine who they might have been. I get the real material that I could use, but often that's very thin. And then I elaborate by imagining another layer of depth to their life. So there was one character in the book called Charlie Byrne, and he was very loosely based on a boy called Charles Donaghy, who was from a single family here in Melbourne, and he joined the troupe with his brother. So I reconstructed those pair of brothers who were originally called Charles and Leslie, and I called them Charlie and Lionel. Such an imaginative lead. And I changed their last name to Byrne because that was easier to say than Donaghy. And there'd been another Byrne in the troupe. So I was playing with all this, and I was using the Magic Collection a lot because I decided that Charlie Byrne was going to be a magician. And that was going to be his special skill within the troupe. And he was going to do magic tricks, and he was going to be really interested in Indian magic, which was a very common thing for boys of that era to be obsessed with.
Yeah.
Like magic was huge in 1910, and that's what you gave to a kid for Christmas. You gave him a box of magic tricks.
Yeah.
So Charlie Byrne's 13. He's obsessed with magic. I wrote a little scene where his uncle gives him a book of magic. Then I drafted another scene where he sits on a veranda with Posy Swift, who's one of the narrators, and does magic tricks for her, and she falls a bit in love with him. And so he's a great character to write about. And then I went to the State Library and looked through the catalogue checking for books, which was this book that Charlie was going to own. And there was a book in the Alma catalogue which was called The Boy's Book of Conjuring, which was published in the 1880s. And so it fitted the date that Charlie Byrne, my imaginary character, might have owned it, and it was probably full of tricks that I was going to be able to use to give to my character, and it was going to be the book that his uncle gave him. So I went to the Heritage Reading Room and I ordered up the book. They brought it out and I put my little white gloves on, like you do when you're handling an old, rare book, and notated the cover. It sort of had a brown embossed leather cover. So I wrote all that in to the scene. I thought, yep, now find the trick. And I opened it up, and inside the cover it said, "To Charlie Byrne."
No.
Yeah, true. To Charlie Byrne from PJ Green. And, 20 years before the imaginary Charlie Byrne, based on Charles Donaghy, went to India, there was a real Charlie Byrne who owned the book that I had actually randomly selected from 8,000 items in the catalogue.
It's pretty amazing.
It was really spooky. And then it was really even spooky because somebody had written in blue ink down the bottom in the book too. that it was found while demolishing an old house in Collingwood in Melbourne.
Oh, really?
And guess where I decided Charlie had already come from?
Not Collingwood.
Yeah.
No.
so
It can't
that
be
was a
true.
bit... Yeah,
Truth is stranger than fiction.
It
right?
was. It was really strange. It unnerved me so badly. I changed his name to Percy for a while because I just...
You just got too creeped out.
It
by
was too creepy. And then I changed it back because I thought, oh, well, that's fate. It's
It is,
kismet.
absolutely.
It's sort of meant to be. But, it was just so fun. I'm so sad that I don't... I might have to apply again for another book.
We might let you back in.
Because it was just... There were so many treasures to, and there were so many fantastic avenues to go off on. And to just have that time to actually be in the library and indulge in going down all those rabbit holes, going down the rabbit hole of, reading all about one particular aspect of India, reading cookbooks endlessly to get all, to nail the diet of the time. And it was also interesting where the gaps were too, because I think, again, the way we shape our narratives and history, like the gap of not finding any books about the Empire Circuit, having to work from primary sources almost exclusively because nobody had gone near that sort of theatre history in that way and thought about what it means in terms of colonialism and what those continuous connections are. Because I think in 1947, when India became independent, there was a break in our consciousness that we cut ourselves away from our connection with them, and in a way that was a terrible loss. I mean, it is a terrible loss because there's still a very small understanding about how enmeshed our two histories are and about all those layers of connection that we really, really have. And it's not about the exotic other, it's about the shared experience of being a post-colonial, well, they'll say in India that we're a post-colonial colonial nation because we still have the Queen, which is pretty funny.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Because they got rid of her a long time ago. So
that idea of how we connect with India is interesting. And one of your trips to India was through the Bookwallah event, which you've described as a wild, crazy, brilliant idea. So can you tell us a little bit about Bookwallah and what that adventure was like?
Well, Bookwallah grew out of India Dark, and in a way, and it grew out of the State Library Fellowship because that was the thing that came first, which made me realise I'd have to go to India, that there's no way that I could write those places without having visited them, and that there wasn't enough secondary source to help pull it all together. That I was going to have to go and do that myself. And when I went to India, one thing I really realised is that we'd been cut off from accessing really fantastic Indian books. And that's to do with, again, with colonialism and the way, this is a complex technical idea about how stories work, and an economic problem that we have is that English language publishing runs out of New York and London. And that shapes the stories we read here, and that shapes the stories that they read in India. And when India Dark came to be published, a publisher in Delhi wrote to me and said, whatever you do, keep the Indian rights. Don't let the British have the Indian rights. Don't let anybody else have the Indian rights, because I want to publish it in India, and if it's published in the UK, it will never come to India.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because what happens, and this is a hangover from colonial era, is that after the First World War, basically, America and England carved up the world. And they said, we'll have these territories and we'll distribute our books to them, and you can have those territories and you distribute your books to them. So the British got India, and America got Canada, South America, and the Philippines, which you can actually see in the sort of books that you access in those countries. Singapore was everybody's. And Australia, of course, we belong to Britain. So all the old empire countries receive British books. So what the British publishers do, and I don't think they even consciously think about the damage that's doing to the way stories move between territories, is that if you publish in the UK publisher will want your Indian rights. But then they're unlikely to take your story to India because it's too much work.
Right.
It's only if it's a breakout bestseller like Harry Potter that it will reach India in an Indian edition. And so when India Dark was published, and I wanted it to be published in India, and said, the Indian rights are going to the Delhi publisher. A lot of UK publishers, 5 people were interested in it. Only 1 would agree to take it without India.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And that was for a fraction of the advance. And that was a real shock.
Yeah, yeah.
Because then all of a sudden I realised that this was happening to everybody, and mostly people just sign it away.
Yeah,
so Australian books, Australian books, unless they've really gone gangbusters into international markets, they're not available. And the shock of going to India, I was on stage with Tom Keneally at the Calcutta Book Fair, and I felt like about that big because I thought,
Superstar.
I'm nobody and he's a superstar. And then I got off stage and started chatting to people, and they'd say, "And who is this Mr. Tom Keneally?" And I go, he's really famous. And oh, yes, he wrote Schindler's List, so they knew him for that. But then when I went to the bookshops, you couldn't get his books there. You couldn't get anybody's books there. You couldn't get... It's improved since then. That was 2007. And Tom Keneally's done a lot of work in India, and his books are now more known. But you can still walk into an Indian bookshop and spend half an hour hunting to find a book by an Australian.
And you took a big suitcase of Australian literature with you, didn't you?
Yes, which segues back, good, well done, to Bookwallah. So when Catriona Mitchell and Nick Lowe were putting together the idea for Bookwallah, they looked at writers who actually had some purchase in India already. So that's why I was invited to go. And the idea was that we were going to take all these big trunks of Australian books, which were not available in India, and travel all around India. We went 3,500 kilometres by train. I think I'd got my stripes as a train traveller too.
Absolutely.
So it was
Especially in India.
Me and Benjamin Law. And it was going to be Michelle de Kretzer as well. Unfortunately, she got ill at the last minute. So it was me and Ben.
And a big suitcase,
and
big trunk.
And these big trunks. And our wonderful team. And then we travelled with 3 Indian writers, Chandras Chowdhury, Annie Zaidi, and Sudeep Sen. And we did events and festivals across South India together with these trunks of Australian books. And the 5 of us would get on stage and talk books. And the books that we hadn't been able to read from India, and the books that they'd never read from Australia. And, it was an amazing tour.
Did you fill the trunk up with Indian literature, or what happened?
I filled my suitcase up with Indian literature at the other end. The trunk was at the other end. Books were put in and shipped back to Australia to about trying to sort of bring the books you can't get. But it's still a really big issue, and I'd love to see Australian schools doing some Indian classics instead of To Kill a Mockingbird. There's an amazing book that everybody in high school reads called Train to Pakistan, and it's probably one of the most important novellas of the 20th century, and it's really hard to find in Australia.
Oh, really? Okay.
And every kid in secondary school reads it in India, and it's about partition, and it's actually a beautiful book, and it's really elegant, and it's really well written, and it has sold hundreds of millions of copies inside India, and it's really hard to find in Australia. And you think, well, that's crazy.
Why not? Yeah,
Why not?
Yeah.
Why are we still reading about the American Civil Rights Movement when the whole conflict between Pakistan and India has shaped Australia and shaped our current world, and yet we're not reading those books? So that whole hegemony of London and New York and the stories that they choose to send us via, it's like it goes around and around, is actually really important, and not something I understood at all until I went to India and realised that we weren't in their bookshops and they weren't in our bookshops, except for diaspora literature. So if you look at the Indian writers that you've read, they're usually writers who are expatriates who are living in London or New York or Canada or here. They're no longer living in India. So that's not that they're not wonderful writers, writing great things about India.
But you're just getting one perspective.
But you're only getting one side.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking at you for quite a long time, and you might have questions. So I just want to invite, if anyone in the audience has questions, please ask. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking at you.
No, that was Dutch. So the Empire Circuit actually covered all the empire. I mean, they also went to South Africa on other tours, not this particular tour. They'd go to anywhere that actually had a military presence, and there was an English-speaking audience. And the Dutch also spoke English as well. And really, when you're watching a little girl in fluffy skirts saying, "I'm Fifi from Gay Paris," it doesn't matter what language she's saying it in. So,
universal language.
Yeah, so they often went to Rangoon too, which, Burma was under the English. But basically, they'd go anywhere where there was a colony. So Manila was really popular in the Philippines too, because that was part of the American Empire. So, yeah. For those who well spotted, Batavia is now Jakarta. So.
Now we've got a mic if there are any other questions. Or we can keep talking at you for a bit. No more questions? Okay. Oh, no, we've got one here. We've got a mic.
Did most of the children get back? You were saying about they had to use their own resources to get back. Was there not a concerted effort because it was discussed in Parliament or whatever? Wasn't there an effort to get them back?
Well, there was a lot of confusion about what had happened, and there was lots of people being incredibly outraged, but nobody willing to put any money up for it. That's why it wound up in Parliament, because there was a theory that, the Australian government should bring them back. But they said, well, they're actually contracted to work for this company. This is a business arrangement. And it actually all wound up in the High Court of Madras, where I went and got the court records for it too, which was pretty interesting, because the manager tried to sue them for the money they were making because they were trying to raise money to get home. And he tried to sue them, and they countersued with child abuse. So that actually pulled the whole scandal out. They did eventually get back in May 1910. So it took them about 3 months from their original strike to earn the fares. But these kids were from mostly from single-parent families. Their parents didn't have any money. They were theoretically being sent 30 shillings a month for signing their children over to the company, which they weren't receiving, so they didn't have money to bring them back, and it was expensive. So they did eventually make it home, but it wasn't an easy process. And I think one thing too, within the context of the time, is because a lot of people were really horrible to their parents about it and saying, how could you have put your children on the stage like that? And they suffered a lot of abuse. They were really, turned upon by the Australian public as bad parents. But a lot of them, the option was the jam factory, and we had no government secondary education to speak of back then. So kids finished school at 14, and often they'd be working, working class kids from Richmond and Collingwood and around inner Melbourne would be working in either the Bryant May factory and lying about their age, or in the jam factory down in South Yarra. So parents saw this as a really good option. That their children were going to learn a trade, and they were going to be sent 30 shillings a month, and that the kids would come back and, hopefully be upwardly mobile. But, yeah, so they did make it back. But you have to look, when people are appalled by some of the aspects of the story, and then you look at it in the wider context, you can see why it unfolded the way it did.
Out of curiosity, the relationship that Baby Pollard had with the girl. How old was the girl?
She'd actually turned 18, so she should have been fired. He kept her in the trip because they'd been having an affair since she was 16, right. And which was, very scandalous. He was actually a married man, though he hadn't lived with his wife for over a decade. He hadn't got around they hadn't divorced, and so he was definitely the villain of the piece. But again, it was a little, when I actually read that they had to run away, of course. Then they ran away to South India, and then eventually went to England and then on to America. I don't think they ever returned to Australia. I couldn't find any evidence they ever came back. And they eventually settled in New Zealand and married. So she turned 18 when the scandal broke. So she couldn't be forced to leave him because she was above the age of consent. And so she stayed with him. But all the other children left and came back. So, yeah, it's that interesting paradox too about when is a child not a child, and when does a young woman become a woman, and when is it inappropriate for the relationship to, I don't know if anybody's been watching The Crown on Netflix, and there's all that stuff about Peter Townsend. He was, I was 16 years older than Princess Margaret, and she was a teenager in the household when they started falling in love, and you think, ooh. So, yeah, it was a similar sort of age difference to the difference between, her name was Irene Finlay, the real girl.
No, it's just when you said that some of the girls were as young as 7.
I
did wonder what age the girl he had the affair with was.
Yeah, she was above the age of consent, although possibly under it when they began the affair, and a bit hard to know really. And the little girls who were 7 and 8, they'd been touring since they were 4. They're the ones dancing naked on a balcony in Bombay. So, yeah, very different world.
But it's interesting you say that because there's this huge scandal just breaking in England about a football coach who groomed hundreds of boys, they reckon, and all these boys are just coming forward now. They were sort of like between 10 and 12, and their parents let them go and stay with this coach, and he just... Yeah, coming out. But there's one in particular who was promising these boys the world because they just wanted to be professional footballers. And it is, as I said, it's a real big scandal. There's so many boys now coming forward.
Yeah.
So it is a story that's...
History repeats in horrible ways. So good to open the stories up.
Thank you.
So we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I thought I would briefly transport you from India to the Pilbara. And as you do.
Like you do.
Kirsty, you've just come back from the Pilbara.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that? That sounded like an interesting trip.
Well, you talk about, exotic. Yeah. I think the Pilbara is really exotic. And, I was doing a week of talking in schools in the Pilbara, in Newman, which is a mining town where PHP and Rio Tinto mine for iron ore. And so I spent 3 days in one primary school and 2 in the other. Really interesting kids, very diverse. Interesting, we've got no stories coming out of the Pilbara.
Well, there's something for you.
Well, there was
it's been gifted to you
One
again.
young woman was telling me about her shock. She grew up in the Pilbara. She was actually Torres Strait Islander, but her family worked in the mines, and she had spent all her growing up living at Tom Price, which is a town near Newman. And she said the biggest shock of coming to Perth was to see old people. She said it was so freaky going to a supermarket and seeing so many people over 50 because you don't see old people in the Pilbara.
In the mining towns.
So interesting kids to work with, about 40% Indigenous. And then the other 60% were from all around the world. There were kids from Thailand, Germany, Belgium, the whole world. Quite a lot of Americans. So these were the children of engineers in the school. And we had a pretty wild and crazy week of talking about story and looking at... And they're very different abilities too, because the Māori people, who are the people from around Newman, they only were... sort of, in inverted brackets, discovered. I mean, they discovered themselves millions of years ago. But... that they only had their first interaction with white Australians in the 1950s. Incredible, so they're only a couple of generations into dealing with the West. And I found that really interesting, listening to the way people contextualise the story, where they'd say, this person's really successful because they're working in the mine. And I was thinking, well, this must be like being invaded by aliens because you were all here before, and then it's so recent in their history.
Yeah.
So there were quite a few of Māori kids in the classroom who were, lovely. English was their fourth language, though it was not necessarily something that they were on top of yet. And a whole other way of thinking about story.
Well, looking forward to your next novel based in the Pilbara.
Don't hold your breath for it. But somebody should write it. Anyone here?
Yes,
like go to the Pilbara, write the Pilbara.
Kirsty's gifting you this story.
Yes, definitely. So, I mean... I've never read a novel set in the Pilbara.
Well, there you go.
Has anybody read a novel set in the Pilbara?
No. Well, somebody needs to write one.
Do you know where the Pilbara is? Yes, good.
It's a good start. We know where India is too, I think.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Kirsty for her wonderful talk today.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
Justine.
there's, I think, is it, Jen, 490 programs on at M Pavilion over summer. So I'm sure that if you have a look at the program, you'll find something else that appeals to you too. Thanks for coming today.